Well, so this is actually a rather interesting video that you made, and I've actually thought about this a few times. And this is actually one of the first sort of arguments I started making against Christianity, or at least, the God being worthy of worship, was sort of these problems. You know, why is it that the Jews did all these things supposedly in the Bible? Of course, historically, none of these things actually happened. They were enslaved, they were Canaanites, and all sorts of other things we're finding out. But let's for a second say that everything in the Bible happened. Why would they go out and slaughter all these people? Why would they take slaves? And, there's so many apologetic arguments saying they weren't as bad, and that. Though if you actually read the context, many of them were pretty barbaric. To the front point of, ransoming people's families so that they'll be your eternal slaves and so on. But ignoring all that, I mean, in the context of the time, they were not bad. They were about average for the rest of the civilization around them. The other civilizations were pretty brutal too. And there was a lot of slavery, human and animal sacrifice, all these things that we started to test about the Bible, these Old Testament things, were pretty common. So I can't really fault the Jews for any of the things if these stories were true. But to me, and I think this is where you run into the problem, is that if we are talking about an almighty, all-powerful being, wouldn't he have problems with these events? Wouldn't he have stepped in and stopped them from doing these things? And quite often the excuse is, well, God had to do what was within the time. He had to work with them. He couldn't just suddenly have them not take slaves or be brutal because it was against our nature. He had to do it slowly. But we're also supposedly talking about the God of the New Testament and the all-powerful God that has all these powers and could quite easily, show them great wonders, or just basically say, you didn't have any problems doing other things, obey me and stop doing all these bad things or die. Concerning, he was quite happy to do it, to tell them to disobey me and die for just everything else. And quite often seemed to have to do it because he kept ignoring him. And this to me, more than a lot of things, really just shows to me that the God of the Old Testament really is just, imaginary. At least not right, or at least, it's just a creation of their own tribal God. It's not the God that the Christians worship or the idea that Christians worship. He was the God of the Jews for the Jews. And a lot of archaeology and whatnot is sort of backing this up that Yahweh wasn't, the only God. The Jews didn't think he was the one and only God for the longest time. They just simply thought that he was their God. They were something. I forget the term. Can never remember it. Monolarity or something like that. Basically, they only worshipped one God, but they didn't believe he was the only God. It was just their God that they worshipped and that protected their tribe and guarded them, and it was specifically their God. Worshipping another God wasn't worshipping false idols necessarily. It was worshipping gods of other tribes, and you're breaking your own gods. That's sort of one of the big things that's already been said about why the Christians had a lot of problems, because they refused to worship the Greek and Roman gods. And if you believe that Zeus protects your city and everybody has to at least pay homage to him, if you got a bunch of people who are saying they're thumbing their nose and say your God isn't real, well, you're quite afraid that your God's going to rain down fire and get pissed off and smite you for the blasphemy. And you sort of got this thing with the Jews. You see a lot with that. I mean, some of this is a little bit conjecture, but this is just what I feel. It just seems to me that, yes, it really is an issue of, it was a context of times. And that the God wasn't the God, this all-powerful, almighty God they worshiped. They were worshiping a God that protected them. And I think this is sort of where a lot of the problems lie in, is that you're trying to blend the New Testament God, which is completely different from the Old Testament God, and you're trying to have them line up. Because if you have the God of Jesus and the God that Christians claim to worship and believe in and all this kind of stuff, he would have no problem trying to stop the Jews from worshiping all these things, or doing all these horrible acts. He would condemn them for doing these things. He would stop them and do everything he could, yet he didn't. Or, as the Bible seems to imply, he endorsed all these things. That's why I just feel, to me, I probably rambled a bit, but this is something, one of the first things that sort of started to stick with me was this whole idea that, God had to work within their times. Because it just seems to me that's sort of contradictory to the God that the Christians believe and worship in. Not to mention, if you're the all-powerful, almighty God, you could do stuff to at least convince people that, these things were bad. And, this also goes into the issue of, the Jews weren't that different from the other nations in many ways, technologically or health or other things. Apparently, according to God, they couldn't even defeat iron chariots because, God couldn't defeat these guys with iron chariots. These are, I don't know. You could always sort of use a prime directive that, the idea that giving too much technology too fast would, cause a lot of problems, especially the way Jews kept supposedly turning from Yahweh. But you should still see, some sort of form of advanced knowledge. And you don't see it within, the Bible. At best, a lot of people says, like the ark was divine measurements, perfect measurements for her seaworthy ship, or Solomon's temple was the perfect dimensions for a temple. These are small things, but these are supposedly the extent, or the supposed science in the Bible that do nothing for 2,000 years, and only retroactively do we discover them now, after we know about these things. So all these kind of things, it just seems to me, that that we're talking about a God created by the minds of the people at the time. Because the God only had the knowledge, the ideas, the mentality, the beliefs and morals, and everything else of the people at that time. Nothing that really went beyond a lot of the ideas. The closest could be monotheism, but that seems to come a part of the Babylonian invasion, where they get to run into Zoroastrianism, I think it is. Where the dualism, where you got the good and evil. That's where it seems to really start to kick in, is after the Babylon invasion, where they start worshipping one God and one God only, and believing that it was only one God rather than, a pantheon of gods, with their God being their tribal god. I don't know. Sorry, this is a bit of rambling. It's actually 9 minutes out. Sorry. I do tend to ramble a bit. This is just one thing that sort of irked me and frustrated me when I first, started looking into these things. And I figured I'd give you my thoughts on, the first bit that you did, because this is something I was already an atheist at the time, but it was something that first started to, I look into the problems of the Bible. I hope it's enjoyable, but it's not too rambly for you.